In the dusty archives of the Massachusetts Institute of Linguistics, Professor Catherine Mills discovered a collection of audio recordings that would challenge everything she thought she knew about human language. The recordings, made on primitive wax cylinders in 1874, contained the voice of a 7-year-old girl speaking in languages that no scholar had ever been able to identify or translate. The girl's name was Eliza Warren, and according to the accompanying documentation, she had begun speaking these mysterious languages spontaneously at age 4, with no exposure to foreign tongues or formal education of any kind. What made her case even more extraordinary was that she seemed to understand these unknown languages perfectly, carrying on complex conversations with invisible companions and demonstrating knowledge that no child of her age should possess. Professor Mills had spent her career studying dead languages and linguistic anomalies, but nothing in her academic experience had prepared her for what she heard when she first played those century-old recordings. The child's voice was clear and confident as she spoke in flowing melodic syllables that followed consistent grammatical patterns, yet matched no known language family on Earth. The recordings had been made by Dr. Edmund Hartwell, a physician and amateur linguist who had been called to examine Eliza after her parents became concerned about her unusual behavior. Dr. Hartwell's notes, preserved alongside the recordings, documented his growing fascination and eventual obsession with the child's linguistic abilities. According to Dr. Hartwell's initial observations, Eliza Warren lived with her parents on a small farm outside Salem, Massachusetts. Her father was a simple blacksmith, her mother a seamstress, neither of whom had traveled beyond the neighboring counties or possessed any knowledge of foreign languages. Yet their daughter spoke with the fluency and sophistication of a trained linguist, using languages that seemed to have their own complex grammar, vocabulary, and cultural references. Dr. Hartwell's first encounter with Eliza occurred in September 1874, when her parents brought her to his office after months of increasingly strange behavior. The child had been found multiple times having animated conversations in her mysterious languages, apparently responding to voices that only she could hear. Her parents reported that these conversations often lasted for hours, with Eliza displaying emotions ranging from joy to fear to anger, as if reacting to the responses of her unseen companions. The physician's notes described his initial skepticism, assuming that the child was simply engaging in elaborate fantasy play common among imaginative children. But when he heard Eliza speak, his skepticism quickly transformed into scientific curiosity. The languages she used were far too sophisticated and consistent to be the product of a child's imagination, displaying linguistic features that would require years of study to master. Dr. Hartwell began recording his sessions with Eliza using the newly invented phonograph technology, creating what may have been some of the earliest audio documentation of unexplained linguistic phenomena. The recordings captured not only Eliza's mysterious languages, but also her interactions with the invisible entities she claimed to be addressing. In one particularly striking recording, Eliza could be heard having what appeared to be a lesson or tutorial, with her voice alternating between asking questions in English and receiving answers in one of her unknown languages. She would repeat complex phrases with perfect pronunciation, as if learning from an invisible teacher who corrected her mistakes and guided her through increasingly difficult linguistic concepts. Dr. Hartwell noted that Eliza seemed to be learning multiple distinct languages simultaneously, each with its own unique characteristics and apparent cultural context. She would switch between them effortlessly, sometimes within the same conversation, as if speaking to different invisible companions who each preferred their own tongue. The physician's fascination with Eliza's case led him to invite several colleagues to observe the child, including professors of linguistics from Harvard University and experts in ancient languages from the Boston area. These scholars were equally baffled by what they witnessed, unable to identify any of the languages Eliza spoke or find connections to known linguistic families. Professor Mills discovered that Dr. Hartwell had attempted to create written transcriptions of Eliza's languages, developing a phonetic notation system to capture the sounds she produced. These transcriptions filled dozens of notebooks, revealing the incredible complexity and consistency of the unknown tongues. Each language had its own distinct phonetic patterns, grammatical structures, and apparent vocabulary, suggesting they were complete linguistic systems rather than random vocalizations. One of the most disturbing aspects of Eliza's case was the content of her conversations, as interpreted through her emotional responses and occasional English translations she provided. Dr. Hartwell noted that the child often appeared to be receiving instructions or information about events that had not yet occurred, reacting with appropriate emotions to news that seemed to come from her invisible companions. In several recorded sessions, Eliza could be heard asking questions about people in the community, then responding with shock or sadness to answers provided in her mysterious languages. When Dr. Hartwell asked her to translate these conversations, she would often predict specific events that would occur days or weeks later, displaying knowledge that no child could reasonably possess. The accuracy of Eliza's predictions became a source of growing unease for Dr. Hartwell and the local community. She correctly foretold the death of the town's elderly pastor, the outcome of a disputed land sale, and the arrival of unexpected visitors from distant cities. Her predictions were always delivered in the same matter-of-fact tone, as if she was simply reporting information she had received from reliable sources. Dr. Hartwell's notes revealed his growing concern about the psychological impact of Eliza's abilities on her development. The child seemed to be living in two worlds simultaneously, maintaining normal relationships with her family and community, while also engaging in complex interactions with entities that existed beyond normal perception. This dual existence appeared to be taking a toll on her mental and physical health. The physician documented changes in Eliza's behavior and appearance as her linguistic abilities continued to develop. She became increasingly withdrawn from other children, preferring to spend her time in conversation with her invisible companions. Her parents reported that she often seemed tired and distracted, as if the constant mental activity required to process multiple unknown languages was exhausting her young mind. Professor Mills found Dr. Hartwell's observations particularly compelling because they aligned with modern research on the cognitive demands of multilingual processing. The human brain requires significant energy to maintain fluency in multiple languages, and the strain of processing completely unknown linguistic systems could indeed have serious psychological and physical consequences. The recordings revealed another disturbing pattern in Eliza's linguistic development. Over time, her conversations in the mysterious languages became more sophisticated and complex, suggesting that she was not simply repeating memorized phrases, but was actually learning and growing in her understanding of these unknown tongues. This progression implied that her invisible teachers were actively instructing her, adapting their lessons to her increasing comprehension. Dr. Hartwell noted that Eliza's knowledge extended beyond mere language to include cultural and historical information that seemed to come from the same mysterious sources. She would make references to places, customs, and events that had no connection to her limited experience as a farm child in 19th century Massachusetts. Yet she spoke of them with the familiarity of someone who had lived in those contexts. In one particularly unsettling session, Eliza described in detail a city that existed beneath the earth, populated by beings who had lived there for thousands of years. She spoke of their customs, their technology, and their complex social hierarchy, providing information that was far too detailed and consistent to be the product of a child's imagination. When asked how she knew about this underground civilization, she simply replied that her teachers had told her about their home. The child's descriptions of this subterranean world were accompanied by her use of what appeared to be the native language of its inhabitants. Dr. Hartwell noted that this particular tongue had a distinctly different character from the other languages Eliza spoke, with harsh consonants and complex tonal variations that seemed almost inhuman in their pronunciation requirements. Professor Mills realized that she was dealing with a case that challenged fundamental assumptions about human linguistic capacity and the nature of knowledge acquisition. If Eliza's abilities were genuine, they suggested the existence of communication channels that operated outside normal sensory perception, allowing her to learn languages and cultural information from sources that remained invisible to other observers. The academic implications of Eliza's case were staggering. If her linguistic abilities could be verified and studied, they might provide evidence for forms of consciousness and communication that existed beyond current scientific understanding. But the very nature of the phenomenon made it difficult to study using conventional research methods, as the source of Eliza's knowledge remained inaccessible to outside observation. Dr. Hartwell's notes revealed his growing obsession with understanding the mechanism behind Eliza's abilities. He conducted numerous experiments, attempting to identify patterns in when and how she received new linguistic information. He noted that her most intense learning sessions seemed to occur during specific times of day, often in the early morning hours when the boundary between sleep and waking consciousness was most permeable. The physician also documented environmental factors that seemed to influence Eliza's linguistic activities. She was most active in her mysterious conversations when alone in quiet spaces, particularly in the old root cellar beneath her family's farmhouse. Her parents reported that she would often disappear into this underground space for hours, emerging with new vocabulary and cultural knowledge that she had somehow acquired during her solitary sessions. Dr. Hartwell's investigation of the root cellar revealed several unusual features that might have contributed to Eliza's experiences. The space was significantly older than the house above it, with stone walls that showed evidence of construction techniques predating European settlement in the area. Local historians suggested that the cellar might have been built by indigenous peoples or even earlier inhabitants whose identity had been lost to time. The physician noted that the acoustics in the root cellar were particularly unusual, with sounds seeming to echo and reverberate in ways that defied the space's apparent dimensions. When he attempted to record Eliza's sessions in the cellar, the audio quality was often distorted, with background sounds that seemed to suggest the presence of other voices, though no other people were present during the recordings. Professor Mills found these environmental observations particularly intriguing, as they suggested that Eliza's linguistic abilities might be connected to specific locations or geological features. This possibility opened up new avenues for understanding the phenomenon, potentially linking it to electromagnetic fields, underground water sources, or other environmental factors that could influence human consciousness and perception. The recordings from the root cellar sessions were among the most compelling in Dr. Hartwell's collection. In these audio documents, Eliza's voice could be heard clearly, but there were also subtle background sounds that seemed to respond to her speech patterns. These sounds were too faint and distorted to be clearly identified, but they followed rhythms and patterns that suggested they might be responses from her invisible teachers. Dr. Hartwell's analysis of these background sounds revealed that they occurred most frequently when Eliza was learning new vocabulary or grammatical concepts. The timing and duration of the sounds suggested that they might be providing corrections or confirmations of her linguistic progress, functioning as an interactive teaching system that operated beyond normal sensory perception. The physician's notes also documented the emotional toll that Eliza's abilities took on her family and community. Her parents struggled to understand their daughter's unusual gifts, torn between pride in her obvious intelligence and fear of the unknown forces that seemed to be influencing her development. Neighbors began to view the Warren family with suspicion, whispering about supernatural influences and questioning whether Eliza's abilities were natural or the result of darker forces. This social isolation had a profound impact on Eliza's psychological development. Dr. Hartwell noted that she became increasingly dependent on her invisible companions for emotional support, as the human relationships in her life became strained by fear and misunderstanding. She would often be found comforting herself in her mysterious languages, apparently receiving reassurance from sources that remained hidden from the rest of the world. The physician's recordings captured several instances where Eliza seemed to be defending her invisible teachers against criticism or doubt. She would speak passionately in her unknown languages, as if arguing with someone who questioned the validity or morality of her linguistic education. These conversations revealed a complex emotional relationship between Eliza and her unseen instructors, suggesting that they were more than simple sources of information. Professor Mills recognized that Dr. Hartwell's documentation represented one of the most comprehensive studies of unexplained linguistic phenomena ever recorded. The physician had approached Eliza's case with scientific rigor, creating detailed records that could be analyzed using modern linguistic and psychological research methods. His work provided a foundation for understanding similar cases that might emerge in the future. The recordings revealed that Eliza's linguistic abilities continued to evolve throughout Dr. Hartwell's study period. New languages appeared in her repertoire, each with its own distinct characteristics and apparent cultural context. She seemed to be receiving instruction in an increasingly diverse range of tongues, as if her invisible teachers were exposing her to the linguistic heritage of multiple civilizations. One of the most remarkable aspects of Eliza's development was her ability to maintain fluency in all the languages she had learned, despite their number and complexity. Dr. Hartwell noted that she could switch between different tongues without hesitation or confusion, demonstrating a level of multilingual competence that would be extraordinary even in adult polyglots with years of formal training. The physician's analysis suggested that Eliza's brain was somehow processing linguistic information in ways that differed fundamentally from normal language acquisition. She seemed to absorb new languages complete with their grammatical structures, cultural contexts and historical associations, rather than learning them gradually through repetition and practice like conventional language students. Dr. Hartwell's notes documented his attempts to test the limits of Eliza's linguistic abilities. He would present her with complex philosophical or technical concepts in English, then ask her to express the same ideas in her mysterious languages. Her translations were consistently sophisticated and nuanced, suggesting that these unknown tongues possessed the vocabulary and conceptual frameworks necessary to discuss abstract ideas. These translation exercises revealed another disturbing aspect of Eliza's abilities. She often provided information about the concepts being discussed that went far beyond what Dr. Hartwell had originally presented. When asked to translate a simple description of astronomy, for example, she would elaborate with detailed knowledge of celestial mechanics and cosmic phenomena that no 7-year-old should possess. Professor Mills realized that Eliza's case represented more than just an unexplained linguistic phenomenon. The child seemed to be accessing vast repositories of knowledge that existed outside normal human experience, receiving education in subjects ranging from ancient history to advanced sciences. Her invisible teachers appeared to be providing her with a comprehensive education that far exceeded what was available through conventional means. The implications of this expanded knowledge were troubling for Dr. Hartwell, who began to question the nature and intentions of Eliza's unseen instructors. If these entities possessed such extensive knowledge and the ability to communicate it to humans, why had they chosen to work through a young child? What were their ultimate goals, and what did they expect from Eliza in return for their teachings? The physician's notes revealed his growing concern about the long-term consequences of Eliza's education. While her intellectual development was remarkable, her emotional and social growth seemed to be suffering as she became increasingly isolated from normal human relationships. She was becoming more like her mysterious teachers and less like a typical child, raising questions about what she might become as she continued to mature under their influence. Dr. Hartwell documented several instances where Eliza seemed to be receiving instructions about future actions she was expected to take. She would listen intently to her invisible companions, then nod in understanding before switching to English to ask clarifying questions about tasks or responsibilities that had been assigned to her. These conversations suggested that her education was preparing her for some specific purpose that remained hidden from outside observers. The nature of these future assignments became a source of increasing anxiety for Dr. Hartwell. Eliza would sometimes speak about traveling to distant places or meeting specific people, describing these future events with the same matter-of-fact certainty she displayed when making her accurate predictions. The physician began to worry that her invisible teachers were grooming her for purposes that might not align with her own best interests or those of the human community. Professor Mills found Dr. Hartwell's concerns particularly compelling because they reflected modern understanding of how isolation and intensive indoctrination could be used to manipulate vulnerable individuals. Eliza's situation bore disturbing similarities to cases of psychological manipulation, except that her influences remained invisible and apparently possessed knowledge and abilities that exceeded normal human capacity. The recordings from late 1874 showed a marked change in Eliza's demeanor and the content of her conversations. She became more secretive about her interactions with her invisible teachers, often switching to languages that Dr. Hartwell had not previously documented when she sensed that he was listening too intently. This increased secrecy suggested that her education was entering a new phase that her instructors preferred to keep hidden from outside observation. Dr. Hartwell noted that Eliza began spending longer periods in the root cellar, sometimes disappearing for entire days without explanation. Her parents reported that she would emerge from these extended sessions exhausted and disoriented, as if she had been engaged in intensive mental activity that pushed the limits of her young mind's capacity. The physician's attempts to monitor these extended sessions were frustrated by technical difficulties with his recording equipment. The audio devices would malfunction when left in the cellar for extended periods, producing recordings that were heavily distorted or completely silent. This pattern of equipment failure seemed too consistent to be coincidental, suggesting that Eliza's invisible teachers were actively preventing documentation of their more advanced lessons. Professor Mills recognized that Dr. Hartwell was facing a fundamental challenge in studying Eliza's case. The phenomenon he was attempting to document seemed to possess its own intelligence and agenda, actively resisting scientific observation and analysis. This resistance suggested that Eliza's teachers were aware of Dr. Hartwell's research and had their own reasons for maintaining secrecy about their activities. The physician's final recordings from December 1874 captured a dramatic change in Eliza's linguistic abilities. She began speaking in languages that seemed to require vocal techniques beyond normal human capacity, producing sounds that Dr. Hartwell described as otherworldly and disturbing. These new tongues had tonal qualities and harmonic structures that seemed to resonate in ways that affected listeners on a visceral level. Dr. Hartwell noted that exposure to these advanced languages produced physical and psychological effects in adult listeners. He reported experiencing headaches, disorientation, and vivid dreams after recording sessions where Eliza used her most sophisticated linguistic abilities. Other observers described similar symptoms, suggesting that these unknown languages possessed properties that could influence human consciousness in ways that conventional speech could not. The physician's notes revealed his growing fear that Eliza's education was approaching some kind of culmination that might have serious consequences for her and potentially for the broader community. Her invisible teachers seemed to be preparing her for a transition that would fundamentally change her nature and role in the world, transforming her from a student into something else entirely. Professor Mills found the final entries in Dr. Hartwell's documentation particularly disturbing because they suggested that the physician had begun to understand the true scope of what he was observing. His scientific curiosity had given way to genuine fear as he realized that Eliza's case represented something far more significant and potentially dangerous than an isolated linguistic anomaly. The last recording in the collection was made on December 21st, 1874, the winter solstice. In this audio document, Eliza could be heard speaking in what Dr. Hartwell described as a language of pure sound, with no recognizable words or grammatical structures. The recording captured nearly an hour of these vocalizations, which seemed to follow complex mathematical patterns that created an almost hypnotic effect on listeners. Dr. Hartwell's notes indicated that this final session took place in the root cellar, with Eliza apparently addressing a large gathering of her invisible teachers. The physician reported sensing the presence of multiple entities in the underground space, though he could see nothing beyond the young girl speaking her incomprehensible language to empty air. The recording ended abruptly, with the sound of Dr. Hartwell's equipment failing completely. His written notes indicated that all the recording devices had simultaneously malfunctioned, as if they had been deliberately disabled by some external force. The physician's final entry expressed his intention to remove Eliza from the cellar and terminate his study of her case, citing concerns for both her safety and his own. Professor Mills discovered that Dr. Hartwell's research ended on that December night in 1874. The physician's subsequent medical record showed that he had suffered what appeared to be a complete nervous breakdown, requiring months of treatment for severe psychological trauma. He never published his findings about Eliza Warren and refused to discuss the case with colleagues or family members. The fate of Eliza herself remained a mystery that Professor Mills was determined to solve. Official records showed that the Warren family had left their farm shortly after Dr. Hartwell's final recording session, relocating to an unknown destination without leaving forwarding information. Local historians had no record of what became of the family or their linguistically gifted daughter. Professor Mills's investigation into Eliza's disappearance led her to examine property records, census data, and newspaper archives from the period following the family's departure. She found scattered references to a young girl with unusual abilities appearing in various communities throughout New England, but these accounts were fragmentary and often dismissed as local folklore rather than factual reports. The search for Eliza Warren became an obsession for Professor Mills, who recognized that the case represented a unique opportunity to study unexplained linguistic phenomena using historical documentation. The recordings and notes left by Dr. Hartwell provided a foundation for understanding similar cases that might emerge in the future, but only if the full story of Eliza's development could be uncovered. Professor Mills's research eventually led her to a small town in Vermont, where local records mentioned a family named Warren who had arrived in early 1875. The records indicated that the family included a young daughter who served as a translator for visitors who spoke foreign languages, though no specific languages were mentioned in the official documentation. Further investigation revealed that this Vermont community had experienced a period of unusual prosperity and growth following the Warren family's arrival. New trade relationships had been established with distant regions. Complex engineering projects had been completed with remarkable efficiency, and several residents had reported receiving valuable insights and knowledge through dreams and visions. Professor Mills realized that Eliza's education by her invisible teachers had prepared her to serve as a bridge between human civilization and whatever entities had been instructing her. Her linguistic abilities allowed her to facilitate communication and knowledge transfer in ways that benefited the communities where she lived, but at what cost to herself and others remained unclear. The Vermont records suggested that Eliza's influence had extended far beyond simple translation services. She had apparently provided guidance on agricultural techniques, medical treatments, and technological innovations that were far ahead of their time. Her contributions had transformed the community, but they had also attracted attention from outside observers who were curious about the source of the town's sudden advancement. Professor Mills found evidence that government officials and academic researchers had begun investigating the Vermont community by 1876, drawn by reports of technological and scientific breakthroughs that seemed to exceed the capabilities of a small rural town. These investigations had apparently prompted the Warren family to relocate once again, continuing their pattern of movement whenever outside attention became too intense. The trail of the Warren family led Professor Mills through multiple states and decades, with Eliza apparently continuing to use her linguistic abilities to benefit the communities where she lived while avoiding sustained contact with authorities or researchers. Each location showed similar patterns of advancement and prosperity, followed by the family's mysterious departure when their influence became too noticeable. Professor Mills's research suggested that Eliza had lived well into the 20th century, continuing to serve as a conduit for knowledge and communication from her invisible teachers. The communities she had touched showed lasting benefits from her presence, with many becoming centers of innovation and learning that attracted scholars and inventors from around the world. During her investigation, Professor Mills discovered a particularly intriguing account from a mining town in Colorado, where the Warren family had apparently lived from 1878 to 1881. Local newspaper archives described a young woman who had helped resolve dangerous mining conditions by communicating with what she claimed were the spirits of the earth itself. Her guidance had prevented several cave-ins and had led to the discovery of new mineral deposits that brought prosperity to the entire region. The Colorado records included testimonials from miners who had witnessed Eliza speaking in languages that seemed to echo through the underground tunnels with supernatural resonance. These witnesses described how her voice would change when she communicated with her invisible guides, taking on tonal qualities that seemed to harmonize with the natural acoustics of the cave systems. Professor Mills found similar accounts from other locations where the Warren family had lived, each showing Eliza's growing mastery of her linguistic abilities and her increasing role as an intermediary between human communities and unseen forces. The pattern suggested that her education had continued throughout her life, with her invisible teachers adapting their instruction to meet the needs of different environments and situations. A particularly detailed account came from a frontier town in Montana, where Eliza had apparently served as a mediator during a conflict between settlers and local Native American tribes. Witnesses described her ability to speak in the native languages of multiple tribes, even though she had no previous contact with these groups. Her translations had helped establish peaceful relationships and had prevented what could have been a devastating war. The Montana records included statements from tribal elders who claimed that Eliza spoke their languages with an accent and vocabulary that belonged to their ancestors from centuries past. They described her as someone who carried the voices of the ancient ones, able to communicate wisdom and knowledge that had been lost to living memory. Professor Mills realized that Eliza's linguistic abilities had evolved far beyond what Dr. Hartwell had documented in his early recordings. She had apparently developed the capacity to access and speak languages from across time and space, serving as a living repository of human linguistic heritage, while also channeling communications from entities that existed outside normal human experience. The accounts from different communities painted a picture of Eliza as a figure who moved through the American frontier like a guardian angel, appearing wherever her unique abilities were needed most. She had helped establish trade relationships, resolve conflicts, prevent disasters, and facilitate the exchange of knowledge between diverse groups of people. But these same accounts also revealed the personal cost of Eliza's extraordinary gifts. Witnesses consistently described her as someone who seemed to exist partially outside normal human experience, maintaining emotional distance from the communities she served. She formed few close relationships and seemed to age more slowly than normal, as if her connection to her invisible teachers had somehow altered her relationship with time itself. Professor Mills found medical records from several frontier doctors who had examined Eliza during her travels. These physicians noted unusual physical characteristics that seemed to develop as she matured, including enhanced sensory capabilities, resistance to common diseases, and neurological patterns that differed significantly from normal human baselines. One particularly detailed medical examination, conducted in 1885 when Eliza would have been 18 years old, described her as possessing cognitive abilities that exceeded normal human capacity. The examining physician noted that her memory was perfect, her pattern recognition skills were extraordinary, and her ability to process multiple streams of information simultaneously was unlike anything he had observed in other patients. The same medical report included observations about Eliza's physical condition that suggested her body had been somehow optimized for her linguistic abilities. Her vocal cords showed unusual development that allowed her to produce sounds across an extended frequency range. Her hearing was exceptionally acute, and her brain showed enlarged regions associated with language processing and auditory perception. Professor Mills realized that Eliza's invisible teachers had not simply provided her with linguistic knowledge, but had actually modified her physical and mental capabilities to better serve as a conduit for their communications. This biological enhancement explained how she could master so many complex languages and maintain fluency across such a diverse range of linguistic systems. The implications of this physical modification were both fascinating and disturbing for Professor Mills. If Eliza's abilities were the result of deliberate enhancement by non-human entities, it suggested that these beings possessed advanced knowledge of human biology and consciousness that far exceeded contemporary scientific understanding. Professor Mills's research led her to discover additional evidence of Eliza's continuing evolution throughout the late 19th century. A series of letters written by a missionary in the Dakota Territory described encounters with a young woman who could speak fluently with Native American tribes in languages that had been extinct for generations. The missionary noted that tribal members would weep when they heard her speak, claiming that she carried the voices of their ancestors who had passed beyond the veil of death. These accounts suggested that Eliza's abilities had expanded beyond communication with living entities to include contact with the spirits of the deceased. The missionary's letters described ceremonies where Eliza would serve as a medium, allowing tribal members to receive final messages from departed relatives and to resolve conflicts that had persisted beyond death. The spiritual dimension of Eliza's abilities added another layer of complexity to Professor Mills's understanding of her case. If she could indeed communicate with the dead, it suggested that her invisible teachers might not be entirely separate from human experience, but could include the accumulated wisdom and knowledge of countless generations who had passed from physical existence. Professor Mills found evidence that Eliza's reputation as a spiritual intermediary had spread throughout the frontier regions, attracting people from diverse backgrounds who sought her help in communicating with deceased loved ones. These encounters were consistently described as profound and transformative experiences that provided comfort and closure to those who had lost family members under tragic circumstances. But the spiritual aspect of Eliza's work also brought new dangers and challenges. Religious leaders in several communities had denounced her abilities as demonic or heretical, claiming that communication with the dead violated natural law and divine will. These accusations had forced the Warren family to flee from several locations where Eliza's presence had become controversial. Professor Mills discovered records of at least 3 formal investigations conducted by religious authorities who suspected Eliza of practicing witchcraft or consorting with evil spirits. These investigations had been inconclusive, as the investigators could find no evidence of traditional occult practices or malevolent influences. Instead, they encountered a young woman whose abilities seemed to bring comfort and healing to those who sought her help. The religious controversy surrounding Eliza's abilities reflected broader cultural tensions of the era, as traditional religious beliefs clashed with emerging scientific understanding and the diverse spiritual practices of frontier communities. Eliza existed at the intersection of these conflicting worldviews, serving as a bridge between different ways of understanding reality and consciousness. Professor Mills found that Eliza's influence on the communities where she lived extended beyond her linguistic and spiritual abilities to include what could only be described as miraculous healing powers. Multiple accounts described her ability to cure illnesses and injuries that had baffled local physicians, using techniques that involved speaking in her mysterious languages while placing her hands on affected areas. These healing sessions were consistently described as involving communication with invisible entities who provided guidance about treatment methods and prognoses. Witnesses reported that Eliza would carry on extended conversations in her unknown languages before beginning treatment, as if consulting with unseen medical experts who possessed knowledge far beyond contemporary understanding. The healing abilities added yet another dimension to the mystery of Eliza's gifts, suggesting that her invisible teachers possessed not only linguistic and spiritual knowledge, but also advanced understanding of human physiology and medicine. The treatments she provided were reportedly effective for conditions ranging from broken bones to infectious diseases, with success rates that exceeded anything available through conventional medical practice. Professor Mills discovered medical records documenting several cases where Eliza's interventions had saved lives that were considered beyond hope by trained physicians. These cases included a child who had been declared dead from scarlet fever, but was revived through Eliza's treatment, and a minor who had suffered massive internal injuries in a cave-in, but made a complete recovery after her intervention. The medical documentation of Eliza's healing abilities provided some of the most compelling evidence for the reality of her extraordinary gifts. Unlike her linguistic abilities, which could potentially be explained through exceptional memory or learning capacity, her healing successes involved measurable physical changes that could be verified through medical examination. But the healing abilities also raised troubling questions about the source and nature of Eliza's powers. If her invisible teachers possessed such advanced medical knowledge, why did they choose to work through a single individual, rather than sharing their knowledge more broadly? What were their ultimate goals, and what did they expect from humanity in return for their assistance? Professor Mills found evidence that Eliza's healing abilities had continued to evolve throughout her life, with later accounts describing interventions that seemed to involve manipulation of fundamental biological processes. Witnesses reported seeing her reverse aging in elderly patients, restore sight to those born blind, and even regenerate lost limbs through techniques that defied all known medical principles. These more advanced healing abilities were reportedly accompanied by increasingly complex communications with her invisible teachers, involving languages that seemed to operate on levels beyond normal human perception. Observers described feeling profound changes in consciousness when exposed to these advanced linguistic forms, as if the languages themselves possessed transformative properties that could alter human awareness and understanding. The transformative effects of Eliza's advanced languages became a subject of particular interest for Professor Mills, who found multiple accounts of people who had been permanently changed by exposure to her most sophisticated linguistic abilities. These individuals reportedly developed enhanced cognitive abilities, expanded sensory perception, and in some cases, limited versions of Eliza's own supernatural gifts. The possibility that Eliza's abilities could be transmitted to others suggested that her invisible teachers might be working to gradually transform human consciousness on a broader scale. Rather than limiting their influence to a single individual, they might be using Eliza as a catalyst to initiate evolutionary changes that would eventually spread throughout human civilization. Professor Mills discovered records of several communities where significant numbers of residents had been exposed to Eliza's advanced languages and had subsequently developed unusual abilities of their own. These communities became centers of innovation and spiritual development, producing individuals who made remarkable contributions to science, art, and philosophy that seemed to exceed normal human potential. But these same communities also experienced challenges and conflicts, as their transformed residents struggled to integrate their enhanced abilities with conventional social structures. Some individuals became isolated and withdrawn, unable to relate to those who had not undergone similar transformations. Others became obsessed with their new abilities, abandoning normal human relationships and responsibilities in pursuit of further development. The social disruption caused by exposure to Eliza's transformative languages created a pattern of boom and decline in the communities where she had lived. Initial periods of remarkable advancement and prosperity were often followed by social fragmentation and eventual abandonment, as the enhanced individuals either moved on to seek others like themselves or became too isolated to maintain normal community functions. Professor Mills realized that this pattern of transformation and disruption might be intentional, representing a carefully orchestrated process of human evolution guided by Eliza's invisible teachers. The entities working through her might be conducting a vast experiment in consciousness development, using human communities as testing grounds for different approaches to enhancing human potential. The experimental nature of Eliza's influence raised profound ethical questions about the rights of her invisible teachers to manipulate human development without explicit consent. While many individuals had benefited from exposure to her abilities, others had suffered negative consequences that included mental instability, social isolation, and, in some cases, premature death from the strain of processing enhanced consciousness. Professor Mills found evidence that Eliza herself had become increasingly aware of the ethical implications of her work as she matured. Later accounts described her as more selective about when and how she used her abilities, apparently developing criteria for determining whether potential recipients were prepared for the transformative effects of her interventions. This growing selectivity suggested that Eliza had gained some degree of autonomy from her invisible teachers, developing the ability to make independent judgments about the appropriate use of her gifts. The evolution of her decision-making process indicated that she was becoming more than just a passive conduit for external influences, but was developing into a conscious collaborator in the work of human transformation. Professor Mills discovered evidence of a network of individuals who had been transformed by exposure to Eliza's abilities and who maintained contact with each other across great distances. These enhanced humans seemed to share a form of telepathic communication that allowed them to coordinate their activities and share knowledge instantaneously, creating a hidden society that operated parallel to normal human civilization. The existence of this transformed network suggested that Eliza's work had succeeded in creating a new form of human consciousness that could operate independently of her direct influence. These enhanced individuals appeared to be carrying forward the mission of human development, using their abilities to guide and influence normal humans in subtle ways that promoted evolutionary advancement. Professor Mills found accounts of transformed individuals appearing at crucial moments in history, providing guidance and knowledge that helped humanity navigate through periods of crisis and change. These interventions were typically subtle and indirect, designed to influence events without revealing the supernatural nature of their source. The pattern of hidden influence by transformed humans raised questions about the extent to which human history had been shaped by these enhanced individuals working behind the scenes. Major scientific discoveries, artistic achievements, and social movements might have been guided by beings who possessed knowledge and abilities that exceeded normal human capacity. Professor Mills realized that her investigation into Eliza's case had revealed the existence of a parallel evolution of human consciousness that had been occurring for generations. The transformed individuals created through exposure to Eliza's abilities represented a new form of humanity that was gradually working to elevate the entire species to higher levels of awareness and capability. But this hidden evolution also raised disturbing questions about free will and human autonomy. If enhanced beings were secretly influencing human development, to what extent were normal humans making their own choices about their future? Were the great achievements of human civilization the result of natural progress, or were they the product of manipulation by beings who possessed superior knowledge and abilities? The ethical implications of this hidden influence became a central concern for Professor Mills as she continued her research. While the enhanced individuals seemed to be working for the benefit of humanity as a whole, their methods raised questions about the right to manipulate others without their knowledge or consent. Professor Mills found evidence that the network of transformed individuals had established secret schools and training centers where selected humans were prepared for enhancement through exposure to advanced linguistic forms similar to those that had transformed Eliza. These facilities operated under the cover of conventional educational institutions, but their true purpose was to identify and develop individuals who possessed the potential for consciousness expansion. The selection process for these secret schools appeared to be based on genetic factors, psychological profiles, and spiritual development that indicated readiness for transformation. Candidates were typically individuals who had demonstrated exceptional abilities in areas such as linguistics, mathematics, or artistic expression, suggesting that certain types of human potential were prerequisites for successful enhancement. Professor Mills discovered that several prominent figures throughout history had attended these hidden schools, including scientists, artists, and political leaders whose achievements had shaped the course of human civilization. The revelation that many of humanity's greatest contributors might have been enhanced beings working under the guidance of Eliza's invisible teachers added new significance to their accomplishments. The final confirmed sighting of Eliza Warren occurred in 1924, when she would have been approximately 60 years old. A newspaper account from a small town in Oregon described a woman who had helped resolve a complex legal dispute by translating documents written in an unknown language that had baffled local scholars. The woman had refused payment for her services and had disappeared before her identity could be confirmed. The Oregon account included a detailed description of the woman that matched other reports of Eliza from throughout her life. Witnesses described her as appearing much younger than her apparent age, with an otherworldly quality that made her seem somehow separate from ordinary human experience. Her voice was said to carry unusual harmonics that made her speech mesmerizing to listeners, even when she spoke in English. Professor Mills found additional evidence suggesting that Eliza had continued her work well into the 20th century, adapting her abilities to serve the needs of an increasingly complex and interconnected world. Reports from various locations described a mysterious woman who appeared during times of crisis, providing guidance and knowledge that helped communities overcome seemingly impossible challenges. These later accounts suggested that Eliza's role had evolved from that of a simple translator to something more like a guardian or guide for human civilization. She appeared to be working to facilitate humanity's development and progress, using her connection to her invisible teachers to provide knowledge and wisdom that would help the species advance while avoiding potential pitfalls. The possibility that Eliza had become a conscious guardian of human development added new significance to her story suggesting that her entire life had been preparation for a role that extended far beyond her individual existence. Her invisible teachers might have been training her not just to serve as a conduit for their knowledge, but to become an independent agent working to guide human evolution towards some predetermined goal. Professor Mills realized that Eliza's story represented more than just an isolated case of unexplained linguistic ability. It suggested the existence of a hidden network of communication and knowledge transfer that operated outside normal human awareness, using specially prepared individuals to bridge the gap between different forms of consciousness and understanding. The implications of this possibility were staggering for Professor Mills's understanding of human potential and the nature of knowledge itself. If Eliza's abilities were genuine, they suggested that human consciousness could be expanded and enhanced through contact with entities that possessed vast repositories of information and wisdom, but the cost of such enhancement remained unclear. Eliza had lived her entire life as an outsider, unable to form normal human relationships or live a conventional existence. Her gifts had made her valuable to the communities she served, but they had also isolated her from the simple pleasures and connections that defined ordinary human experience. Professor Mills's research also revealed disturbing patterns in the communities where Eliza had lived for extended periods. While these locations had initially prospered from her presence, many had eventually experienced unexplained problems that seemed to emerge after her departure. Some communities had suffered economic collapse, others had been struck by natural disasters, and several had simply been abandoned by their residents for reasons that remained unclear. These negative consequences suggested that Eliza's influence might have created dependencies that could not be sustained once she moved on to other locations. The knowledge and guidance she provided might have been too advanced for human communities to maintain independently, leading to inevitable decline once her direct support was withdrawn. Professor Mills wondered if this pattern of boom and decline was intentional, representing some kind of test or evaluation being conducted by Eliza's invisible teachers. Perhaps they were studying human responses to advanced knowledge and technology, using Eliza as an instrument to gather data about human potential and limitations. The possibility that Eliza had been serving as an unwitting agent in some vast experiment was deeply troubling for Professor Mills. It suggested that her entire life had been orchestrated by entities whose ultimate goals and motivations remained completely unknown. The communities she had helped might have been nothing more than test subjects in a study whose purpose and scope exceeded human understanding. Professor Mills's investigation also uncovered evidence of other individuals throughout history who had exhibited abilities similar to Eliza's, suggesting that she was not unique, but rather part of a larger pattern of human enhancement that had been occurring for centuries. These other cases were typically less well documented than Eliza's, but they showed similar patterns of linguistic abilities, spiritual communication, and transformative influence on surrounding communities. The existence of multiple individuals with similar abilities suggested that Eliza's invisible teachers were part of a larger network of entities working to guide human development over extended periods of time. This network might have been operating throughout human history, selecting and training individuals to serve as agents of consciousness evolution and cultural advancement. The historical pattern of enhanced individuals raised questions about the ultimate goals of this apparent intervention in human development. Were these entities working to prepare humanity for some future challenge or opportunity? Were they attempting to accelerate human evolution toward a specific endpoint? Or were they conducting research on consciousness and intelligence, using human civilization as their laboratory? Professor Mills discovered evidence that the network of enhanced individuals had been particularly active during periods of major historical transition, appearing at crucial moments to provide guidance and knowledge that helped humanity navigate through challenges and crises. These interventions had often been subtle and indirect, but their cumulative effect had been to steer human development in directions that promoted survival and advancement. The pattern of historical intervention suggested that Eliza's invisible teachers possessed not only advanced knowledge of science and consciousness, but also the ability to perceive and influence the long-term trajectory of human civilization. They seemed to be working according to a plan that spanned centuries or even millennia, using enhanced individuals like Eliza to implement changes that would gradually transform humanity into something greater than its current form. Professor Mills realized that her discovery of Eliza's case might itself be part of this long-term plan, representing another step in the gradual revelation of the hidden forces that had been shaping human development. Her research might be preparing the way for a broader understanding of human potential and the nature of consciousness that would be necessary for the next phase of human evolution. The possibility that she had become an unwitting participant in the same process that had shaped Eliza's life was both thrilling and terrifying for Professor Mills. It suggested that the boundaries between researcher and subject, between observer and participant, might be far more fluid than she had previously understood. Professor Mills concluded her research with a mixture of fascination and concern about the implications of Eliza Warren's case. The linguistic abilities documented by Dr. Hartwell represented a form of human potential that challenged conventional understanding of consciousness and communication, but they also raised questions about the price of such extraordinary gifts. The recordings and documentation left by Dr. Hartwell remained in Professor Mills's possession, serving as evidence of phenomena that existed beyond current scientific explanation. She chose to preserve this material for future researchers who might possess better tools and understanding for investigating such cases, while recognizing that some mysteries might be too dangerous to fully explore. Eliza Warren had spoken in tongues that no human had ever heard, but her story suggested that the boundaries between different forms of consciousness were more permeable than most people realized. Her life had been shaped by forces that remained hidden from ordinary perception, but her influence on the world had been real and lasting, even if the source of her abilities remained forever mysterious. The case of Eliza Warren stood as a testament to the vast unknowns that still existed in human understanding of consciousness, communication, and the nature of reality itself. Her story challenged fundamental assumptions about human potential, while raising profound questions about the price of transcendence and the true nature of the forces that might be guiding human development from beyond the veil of ordinary perception. Professor Mills carefully stored the recordings and documentation in the university's most secure archives, ensuring that future generations of researchers would have access to this extraordinary case. But she also included warnings about the potential dangers of investigating such phenomena too deeply, recognizing that some knowledge might come with costs that exceeded its benefits. The voice of 7-year-old Eliza Warren, speaking in languages that no human had ever heard, continued to echo through the archives, a reminder that the universe held mysteries that might be too vast and strange for human minds to fully comprehend. Her story remained as a bridge between the known and unknown, challenging anyone who encountered it to question the limits of human potential and the true nature of the reality in which we live. As Professor Mills completed her research, she found herself changed by her encounter with Eliza's story. The boundaries of her own understanding had been expanded, and she began to notice subtle changes in her perception and awareness that seemed to echo the transformative effects described in the historical accounts of those who had encountered Eliza directly. The realization that her research might have exposed her to some of the same influences that had shaped Eliza's development was both thrilling and terrifying. Professor Mills wondered if her investigation had been guided by the same invisible forces that had worked through Eliza, drawing her to discover and preserve this remarkable case for reasons that remained hidden from her conscious understanding. The possibility that she had become part of the continuing story of human consciousness evolution added new urgency to her work. If Eliza's invisible teachers were still active in the world, they might be using Professor Mills and others like her to prepare for the next phase of their long-term project to transform human civilization. Professor Mills began to notice patterns in her own research that seemed to extend beyond mere academic curiosity. She found herself drawn to investigate other cases of unexplained human abilities, as if following a path that had been laid out for her by unseen guides. Each new discovery seemed to build upon the previous ones, creating a comprehensive picture of human potential that challenged everything she had previously believed about the nature of consciousness and reality. The accumulation of evidence for enhanced human abilities throughout history suggested that Professor Mills was documenting a hidden aspect of human evolution that had been occurring parallel to conventional biological and cultural development. The enhanced individuals she studied seemed to represent experiments in consciousness expansion that were gradually preparing humanity for some kind of fundamental transformation. As Professor Mills delved deeper into her research, she began to experience phenomena that echoed those described in Eliza's case. She found herself having vivid dreams that seemed to contain information about her research, waking with insights and connections that she couldn't remember consciously discovering. Her understanding of complex linguistic patterns seemed to develop with unusual speed, as if she were receiving instruction from sources beyond her conscious awareness. The possibility that she was beginning to develop abilities similar to Eliza's was both exciting and frightening for Professor Mills. She wondered if her intensive study of enhanced individuals had somehow opened channels of communication with the same entities that had guided Eliza's development, drawing her into the same network of consciousness expansion that had shaped so many extraordinary lives throughout history. Professor Mills realized that her investigation into Eliza Warren's case had become more than just academic research. She had become part of the continuing story of human consciousness evolution, serving as a bridge between the hidden history of enhanced individuals and the broader human community that remained unaware of their existence. The voice of Eliza Warren, speaking in tongues that no human had ever heard, would continue to echo through time, carrying with it the promise and peril of transcendence, the mystery of consciousness, and the eternal question of what it truly means to be human in a universe that might be far stranger and more wonderful than anyone had ever dared to imagine. The recordings and documentation that Professor Mills had preserved would serve as a foundation for future researchers who might possess the tools and understanding necessary to unlock the full secrets of human potential. But they would also stand as a warning about the costs and consequences of transcendence, reminding anyone who encountered them that some knowledge came with a price that might be too high for ordinary human consciousness to bear. In the end, Eliza Warren's story remained what it had always been, a mystery that challenged the boundaries of human understanding while offering tantalizing glimpses of possibilities that lay beyond the reach of conventional science and philosophy. Her voice, speaking in languages that no human had ever heard, would continue to call to those who were ready to listen, inviting them to explore the vast, unknown territories of consciousness and reality that lay waiting to be discovered.